Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about in our little series I'm really looking forward to is de facto and de jure objections to Christianity.
Yes.
All right, it's on the slide.
We have so many objections.
So there's two types of apologetics. We talked about that before. There is like evangelistic apologetics where you're trying to win people over. But that's a little bit different than when somebody attacks you, makes fun of you for being a Christian, bullies you, whatever that is, and you need to defend yourself, right, and justify yourself. That is defensive apologetics. It's a little bit different. A lot of times for defensive apologetics, we'll use something called presuppositional apologetics. Presuppositional apologetics really isn't apologetics at all because it's not a very good way to convince somebody something, but it's a great way to defend yourself, so that's what we're going to talk about. And I got this quote by my professor, who's actually my reader for my thesis, and he wrote this book called Persuasive Apologetics, and he says that apologetics is the art of loving people by addressing their questions in an intellectually rigorous, yet gentle and respectful manner. So the first thing right out of the gate when you're doing apologetics is it's supposed to be ministry. And so you're not trying to truth bomb people. You're not trying to make fun of atheists and tell them how stupid they are. If that's your idea of apologetics, we really don't need you doing apologetics. And I'd rather you not tell people you're a Christian anyway. So if your idea of doing apologetics is to humiliate people, just don't do it at all, please. And so I hope as a Christian, you don't have a desire to humiliate other people anyway, right? We're trying to love people. And so it is a type of ministry. And what you're doing in apologetics is either going to be leading others to Christ or encouraging other believers, right? And that's what you're trying to do. And so as a ministry, it's a service to Christ. And as a service to Christ, it should be led by love. So lead with love people. That's your goal when you're trying to talk to somebody about your faith, about Christianity, about why you believe what you believe. You do it with fear and trembling is what Peter said. So love people, okay? And I'm probably going to say that every single time we meet for this for as long as we do it. But there are many different types of arguments, and there's many different arguments individually, right? We could talk about that until Jesus comes back, of all the different arguments people come up with. So usually what we do is we'll categorize arguments, right? There's types of arguments, but even that doesn't really help a whole lot because there's a whole lot of types. There's a whole lot of kinds of arguments out there. And so the person who did this the best, who I'm going to talk about a lot today, is one of my heroes, Alvin Plantinga. And his name is spelt kind of weird. He is now, his name's spelt Plantinga, but that's not what it is. It's Plantinga. And he was a professor for decades at a couple of different big colleges. And I think he's retired now. He's 90-something years old now. But he's just a great man of God, a great minister, and has done a great job of ministering to people when it comes to things like apologetics and intellectual things, okay? And he broke it down better than anybody. He broke all of this stuff down into two types of arguments, two categories of arguments, which you can see here is de facto and that's right, de facto and de jure.
Those are both Latin words.
That's right, buddy. Who you been talking to?
I read this.
Good job, buddy. That is one smart kid.
De facto means of fact, and de jure means of right.
That's exactly right, you little cheater, pumpkin eater.
What? You wouldn't find that out of the way.
So, de facto is Latin for of fact, and in this context of apologetics, you could use de facto for a lot of things, and it means that there's something factually wrong with Christianity. So there's one type of argument from atheism that's saying that Christianity, there's something wrong with it factually. These are usually very straightforward arguments, and they are hands down the weakest, easiest arguments to deal with. There has never been a successful de facto argument that even was remotely close to being successful or even intellectually sound. Most of these are almost childish, okay? And I'll give you some examples of that. But the thinking here is that we have proven one way or another that Christianity is false. Okay, we've proven it. It's done. I can prove it 100% right now that God doesn't exist. I can prove it for sure right now that Jesus didn't raise from the dead. I can prove it. We know that it's wrong. And obviously, if there had ever been a successful de facto argument, we wouldn't be meeting here today because we'd have already proven that Christianity wasn't true and we had moved on with our lives a long time ago. So some examples of de facto objections are that God does not exist, or that Jesus was not a real historical person, or that there's no such thing as the supernatural, there's no such thing as a human soul. It's those kinds of things, okay? So de facto argument is saying that there's something factually wrong with Christianity. And usually those are not a big deal. Now the other kind, whoops, we double skipped there. The other kind of argument is a de jure argument. And de jure is Latin for of rights. And it's used in a lot of different contexts and legal contexts as well. But in this context, we're talking about arguments that say that Christianity is outside of your intellectual rights. And so put that another way, you have no right to be a Christian. There's something wrong with you, and you need to fix it, okay? And this is not trying to say that we've proven Christianity is wrong. It's trying to say that basically you are an idiot or stupid or a moron or immoral for being a Christian. I have a quote here by Alvin Plantinga that breaks that down. It says, that's in blue there, it says, these are arguments or claims to the effect that Christian belief, whether or not true, now remember that's an important line here, we're not saying that Christianity isn't true. That's not what this argument is, okay? It's a different kind of argument. If we're going to say that Christianity wasn't true, that's a de facto argument, okay? A de jure argument is a little bit different. It says these are arguments that claim to the effect that Christian belief, whether or not true, is at any rate unjustifiable or rationally unjustified or irrational or not intellectually respectable or contrary to sound morality or without sufficient evidence or in some other way is rationally unacceptable, not up to snuff from an intellectual point of view. These are arguments that are saying that there's not enough evidence to support Christian belief is usually what those arguments come down to. So it's kind of different. You think of it this way to make it really simple. The de facto argument saying, I have proven that Christianity is false. And a de jure argument is saying, you can't prove that that's true. See the different flavor there? It's quite a different thing. So that's what they're saying is they're saying, not that Christianity is false, is you're crazy, you're a superstitious idiot. What kind of moron believes in God? See what I'm saying? And so they're saying there's something intellectually wrong with you or even immoral about you for believing that Christianity is true. Some examples there you see in your handout is that the Bible cannot be trusted. Have you ever heard that kind of argument? They won't try to say that God doesn't exist. They'll just say, well, I'm not a Christian because the Bible is full of mistakes. That's a de jure argument. There's something wrong with believing the Bible. You can't trust it. It's full of too many mistakes. Another one is that Christianity is just blind faith. Me and Tyler actually ran into that the other day where somebody kind of said that kind of thing. That's pretty common. It's just blind faith. Or that Christians are evil, hateful, judgmental, and bigoted. That one may be the most popular right now. You think about Good Mythical Morning, those guys who left Christianity because they said that Christianity was hateful, bigoted toward homosexuals, so they weren't going to be Christians anymore. If there's something immoral about Christianity, and you're kind of a bad person if you're a Christian. Generally speaking, is there a way that I could, how do I deal with these types of arguments? How would I deal with the de facto argument, and how would I deal with the de jure argument just in general? De facto objections are really, really, really easy. And these are ones that you really don't even need help with. You don't have to go to your pastor and say, hey, I got a friend that told me this, what would you say? These are easy, like they're easy. They're usually nonsensical. They're usually really childish. Usually they're very old, very overused arguments, okay? So they're going to be arguments that literally, like an argument against God that no one's used in 500 years, and somebody will bring it up, okay? Something that's been thoroughly debunked and disproven many times over. There's never been any kind of evidence in any form, no scientific evidence, no archaeological evidence, no physical evidence, ever, that has supported this idea that the existence of God has been disproven. Ever. Not ever. Okay? There is no rational, philosophical, scientific, or otherwise type argument that proves that God does not exist. Now, some of these objections are going to be very childish. Like, does anybody know Richard Dawkins?
Not personally.
Have you ever heard of Richard Dawkins? Do you know what book he wrote? Anybody?
God delusion.
It's called the God delusion, right? What was his primary premise of the God delusion?
God's mean, therefore he doesn't exist.
God is mean. He's a monster. He's a genocidal maniac. He's bipolar. And he's just a really mean, evil God. And that's why he doesn't exist. That is not even rationally sound. If I said Miss Laura is not paying attention to the lesson, therefore she doesn't exist, would anybody go with that? Anybody buy that? No? Because it's nonsense, right? If I said that God doesn't pay attention to me, or God doesn't give me what I want, or God is mean to me, that does not prove anything at all. But that is an example of de facto, a common de facto objection. Other kinds of arguments are just, they've been used so many times that they're just, it's hard to take them seriously anymore. An example of that would be the argument from human suffering. Anybody familiar with that? What's the argument of human suffering?
That if God was all good, we wouldn't suffer.
Let's see, I think that was first came up in Plato's writing. So it's been around for a minute. I'm trying to remember that guy's name. Euthyphro, right? Isn't that right? The Euthyphro dilemma, I believe, is where that kind of thinking started. Anyway, it's been debunked so many times, literally over thousands of years, that it is hysterical that it's still brought up, but it's still there. I think they kind of come from a place of ignorance. If you've ever gotten online and you see maybe one of these apologists like debate like a teenager or a college student or something, and these guys will come up and they'll say something, it's because they don't understand either their own argument or they don't understand where Christianity is coming from. So it's usually coming from a place of ignorance. Like, for example, the belief that Jesus was not a real person. You know what the problem with that is? You've probably heard me talk about this a lot. What's the problem with saying Jesus wasn't a real person? It's a real common argument from like 200 years ago.
Plenty of evidence that Jesus was not.
Yeah, we have like,
You always say that there's
More evidence than the Abraham Lincoln ever.
yeah, exactly. So there's just this overwhelming amount of evidence for Jesus' life. So if somebody says, well, Jesus wasn't a real person, they're just ignorant of the evidence, right? The problem is that I can't give you a generalized answer for de facto objections because they kind of got to be taken on a case-by-case basis. What I would say is, same thing I kind of said this morning, is that Christianity is true. De facto arguments are trying to make a truth claim about Christianity, that they've proven it's not true. And because Christianity is true, there's always going to be something wrong with the argument, right? There's a great book you ought to read, but she talks about the box, the worldview box, right? And the only thing that's going to fit in the worldview box is the truth. And so if you take atheism and you put it in the worldview box, something's going to be sticking out somewhere, right? It's not going to match up with reality. So the idea of atheism is not going to match reality because atheism isn't true. So, and I know that's a very generalized answer, and we'll get into more as we go to specific cases. But it doesn't matter what the argument is. I promise you, you don't have to be stressed out about it. If they're telling you that Christianity is not true, there's going to be a problem with the argument somewhere. It may be hard to see at first, but there's going to be a problem. I love what George Orwell said in Facing Unpleasant Facts. He says, however much you deny the truth just goes on existing. And so that's the great part about being a Christian, is that you can be mad about it all day long, and it really doesn't matter. So de jure objections are an entirely different issue, and they're much more difficult. The reason why is because de jure objections are a lot more, generally speaking, subjective and opinion-based, and they're a little bit hard. It's a little bit hard to deal with somebody's opinion. If I said, I know for a fact that God is not real because Jesus is not a real person, I can go, okay, well, here's a bunch of archaeological and literary evidence to support Jesus' existence. Argument over, right? But if it's your opinion, I think Jesus was just a bad person and I don't think I should be Christian. That's a little bit harder to deal with, isn't it? I mean, and so you really have to remember something when you're doing apologetics. You're going to hear me say this a lot, is that you've got to be kind and you got to lead with love. If you've ever been in an argument and you realize way too deep that you were wrong, you ever done one of those?
Never been in that. Been wrong.
Yeah, only with your wife. Yeah. Listen, that doesn't feel good, okay? And so you got to remember, if you're trying to convince this person that they're wrong about their unbelief, it's not going to feel good to them. They don't need your help, all right? You're trying to gently walk them through this. You're not trying to go, aha, right? So you got to be kind. Please be kind when you're doing this. But they're a very different issue because they're not making explicit truth claims. They're usually subjective. These kinds of objections are often just trying to say that even though that there's some evidence for Christian belief, and even though we can't disprove Christianity, the evidence just isn't enough. And the problem with this too is the problem of moving goalposts. I remember when Connor was a little bit smaller, when he was like 3-4 years old, we would do a lot of sword fights with. Tyler would always buy Connor things that he could hurt me with, like nunchucks and swords and things. And we would do a lot of fights with nunchucks and swords. And what Connor would do, like I would pretend to die every now and then, but I like to balance it. And every now and then I want to win against my 4-year-old, right? And so I would go to stab him, and Connor would go, "You can't do that. Why? My skin turns into stone when you try to stab me." And he would just, okay, well, how am I supposed to beat that? Well, you can only kill me by stabbing me on the head. And he goes, click. He goes, that doesn't work. I'm wearing a helmet. And he would always, it is like, it didn't matter what you did. You know what I mean? You ever do that with your kid? That's what atheists do. And so they say, you don't have enough evidence. You go, okay, what about this? They'll say, well, that's not enough evidence. And they usually use this line, an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence, right? And they just keep on, and it's never going to be enough for a lot of people, okay? And that makes it really hard to try to get through to people. Some examples of de jure arguments. One is, and this will be a little more extensive because I want to deal mainly today with de jure arguments, because even though we don't have a generalized answer for de facto objections, we do have a generalized answer for de jure objections that is universal and successful against every single de jure argument, because every single de jure argument is saying that you're not justified in being a Christian in one way or another. Maybe it's because they think you're superstitious. Maybe they think you don't have enough evidence. Maybe you think that you're a bigot for being a Christian. You shouldn't be one. There is a generalized answer for de jure arguments that works every time. And so we're going to talk about. So some examples. One's David Hume. David Hume is an old philosopher from the Enlightenment. And Hume believed that miracles were a violation of the laws of nature that were established by firm and unalterable experience. So David Hume basically said that miracles were so beyond reason that it was impossible to believe them. Basically for Hume, if something happened that seemed to be a miracle, it wasn't. Because if it happened in the natural world, there's a natural explanation for it. So by virtue of that fact, if it takes place, in nature, there's a natural explanation for it, therefore it's not a miracle. So even if it seemed like a miracle and looked like a miracle, it wasn't. It may be an oddity of science, it may be a rarity, even Jesus raising from the dead, for example. If Jesus raised from the dead, then it's naturally possible. If it's naturally possible to raise from the dead, then it's not a miracle. It doesn't matter what it is, there can't be such things as miracles. That's basically how he felt about it. If it happened, then it's not a miracle. That's the way he looked at it. And that kind of thinking is carried on to this day. Friedrich Nietzsche, y'all know what Nietzsche was famous for. Because we made a movie about it. Nietzsche is the one, he wrote a poem. Probably the most famous thing he did. I can't even think of anything else that Nietzsche wrote. He wrote this poem called The Madman, and he said in The Madman that God is dead. And so he kind of goes on and he says that basically that Christianity is poorly designed and it produces crummy people. And so that Christianity was designed, and by nature of what Christianity is, it creates bad, immoral, weak, sniveling people, okay? And so you should hate Christianity and flee from it because it's bad for you, and it's bad for your family, and it's bad for, culture, it's bad for society. You kind of get the feeling that maybe Nietzsche had a bad experience at church one time or something. But he had a very bad view, very critical view of Christianity. You also have Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, in general, was just kind of a freak show and had a lot of really uncomfortable things to say about dreams and mothers and things like that. But he also had a lot of uncomfortable things to say about Christianity. He basically said that Christianity is a psychological fantasy, and that's usually what he breaks things down to, that there's something wrong with your psyche, there's something wrong with your brain. And he basically said it was wish fulfillment, that you have some kind of inner child, and that inner child wants a father figure that is always there for them and takes care of them. So you've invented the idea of a heavenly father, and that's why Christianity exists. It's just wish fulfillment. Bart Ehrman, he's still alive, he's still around, he's a modern atheist. He really has kind of a sorry reputation. He's a professional atheist. His full-time job is atheism. He has made millions and millions of dollars off of being an atheist and attacking Christianity. He has a bad reputation for misrepresenting the facts, and in particular, misrepresenting things that scholars say. So like you would say, have a scholar say something about maybe the book of Matthew, and he is real bad about taking things that people say and sort of misconstruing them to make them say something else.
Is Bart Ehrman the one that wrote Misquoting Jesus?
He was the one who wrote Misquoting Jesus. And so he says things like, he wrote, I think in Misquoting Jesus, he makes all these crazy claims about the Bible, and then someone actually confronted him about it later and said, hey, this stuff isn't true. And he said, yeah, I know, but I mean, he's just kind of a dubious sort of character. But his view on Christianity is basically more or less that there's just not enough evidence to support it. And so again, that's a de jure claim, right? So what exactly is the problem? When you talk about someone who has a de jure problem with Christianity, they have a de jure objection, what exactly is their problem with Christianity? You'll run into a lot of people, and I know I have, and you probably have too, that are very, very upset with the fact that you're a Christian. Like, it deeply disturbs them. They cannot stand it. I have been mocked and laughed at. I talked a little bit about that in church this morning. I've been threatened. I've had my job threatened for being a Christian. Even, at the ambulance service, I had a supervisor that attacked me every single day and mocked me and essentially, I don't know what another word is. It sounds like a childish word, but bullied me every day about being a Christian. I was harassed constantly for my Christianity, especially when I was a little bit younger. And so you're going to run into a lot of people that just have a bad problem with the idea that you're a Christian. You're probably not going to run into David Hume or Friedrich Nietzsche because they're dead. By the way, interesting, they're not atheists anymore. They both believe in God now. But you are going to run into people constantly that are heavily influenced by their philosophy. So this is basically kind of how it works, okay? Is that you have sort of the ivory tower, right? You have all these guys like Friedrich Nietzsche and John Locke and a bunch of other people that you've probably, I'm sure you've heard of them, but you don't know anything about them, let's be honest. Who cares what David Hume had to say about anything, right? They write a whole bunch of material that's really influential in university, and that trickles down from university into culture. So you get a bunch of cultural ideas about God, like, hey, Jesus wasn't a real person. And people start saying this to one another. Did you know that Jesus wasn't a real person? Oh, really? I didn't know Jesus wasn't a real person. Yeah, everybody knows, right? And it kind of starts like that. So you have people that are really heavily influenced by David Hume and Friedrich Nietzsche, and they have no idea who these guys are, and they've never heard of them. But they have these kind of cultural ideas that have sort of trickled down into society. So you're going to run into people who have these kind of ideas about Christianity. And the thing is that even if they were very sincere, most atheists and most agnostics that you meet have no idea why they hate Christianity so much. But they have no idea. It just sets them off. It infuriates them. But they don't know why they're so angry about it. And they don't know why. They've never thought through their own beliefs. They don't understand why they have a problem with Christianity. They don't understand why it's so upsetting to them. They just know that it's kind of a repulsive idea, even though they can't really put their finger on it. What I tell people is, and I tell this to anybody, is it's usually good to just ask a lot of questions and try to figure out what it is that they're upset about and what the problem is and why they have such a problem with me being a Christian in particular. Usually the first answer is not really the answer. If they told you, well, it's because it's just blind faith, like, okay, why do you think that it's blind faith? Or how about this? What's wrong with having blind faith? Like, why does that bother you that somebody has a blind faith? Right? And really try to dig in and figure out what it is the problem is, because people think by talking, and unless they have a real conversation with somebody, they're not going to be able to think through their problems. You know, they might go, I've never really thought about that. Just ask some questions and try to and don't be bothered, because it's hard to feel like you're not personally under attack. But remember what Christ said, they don't hate you, they hate him. Be calm and just ask lots of questions. I gave some examples of some questions you can ask there. But just ask lots of questions and try to get to what it is that they really have a problem with. There's a bigger problem here than what you think. There is a problem with the way that we think as a culture, okay? There are two major trends in thinking in the West and specifically in America, okay? That is post-rationalism, which comes from postmodernism, and evidentialism. Okay, these are two besides Christian thinking, these are the most influential types of thinking that we have in the West, okay? Post-rationalism, like I said, it comes from postmodernism. And in post-rationalism, the ultimate taboo is to offend somebody, right? If you told somebody that they were wrong, or, so when you think about the LGBT movement, the transgender stuff, the whole deal with being a furry, you dress up like an animal and you're supposed to pretend like you're an animal, all that stuff, that's post-rationalism. And the worst possible thing you can do is to say that that person is wrong. And what they've done, they're actually pretty smart in how they've done this. They sort of hijacked the civil rights movement in a way. They talk about, let's say, being a cross-dresser the same way you would talk about being racist. If you tell me I can't be a cross-dresser, it's the same way as you being racist against somebody for the color of their skin. And so they kind of took that language and they said, you can't tell me I'm wrong. Well, that's a crazy idea. And people will say, well, where the heck did we go wrong? Like, where did we get off the tracks here? How did we end up here? Well, we got there through postmodernism. And there's something in postmodernism, this main tenet, and it's called relativism. And the idea of relativism is that nothing is true, that nothing is off limits, and at the same time, that everything is true. And what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you, because there's no such thing as objective truth. And it comes from the Enlightenment, and it comes from skepticism, okay? And the idea with skepticism was that we had a really hard time in epistemology trying to find a good system to say something was true or not. And so I would say, I know that I exist, right? Well, how can you prove that you exist? Well, I guess I can't. And it really bothered people like Descartes. Descartes locked himself in a room one day and didn't come out until he was going to get this thing fixed. And he finally, what he came up with famously was, I think, therefore I am. Right? That's the only thing that he knew for a fact that he could prove, was that he was a conscious mind. He couldn't prove that his body was real. He couldn't prove that the world was real. He couldn't prove that what his eyes were seeing was the truth. Like, I look forward and I see a white table, but how do I know that there's actually a white table there? I don't. It's just my senses are telling me there's a white table, and I have no reason to believe my senses. And so it kind of got to this idea of, man, we really can't prove anything at all, can we? And if we can't prove anything at all, then it's ridiculous to say there's such thing as objective truth, because nobody can prove it. And the next thing you know, what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me, because we can't prove anything at all, so why bother? You believe whatever you want to believe, and I'll believe whatever I want to believe. That is for something very culturally accepting, and it doesn't. Especially coming out of the medieval period when we were doing crusades and Christians were killing Muslims and Muslims were killing Christians. Well, what if the Muslims and Christians said, you know what? You believe whatever you want to believe, and I'll believe whatever I believe, and we'll just leave one another alone. And you say, well, that's a pretty appealing idea, isn't it? I like that idea. And so it really sank its teeth into the world. And this is where it's led. It's led to post-rationalism and all of that. Now, luckily, relativism, postmodernism is easy to fix because it is totally untenable. Okay, it is not practical at all. First of all, it's what we call being self-referentially defeating. That means that it doesn't stand up to its own test. This is real silly and it makes people laugh, but it's true. If I were to tell you there was no such thing as absolute truth,
You just said a lie.
then I just lied, because I'm making an absolute statement. So if relativism is true, then it is false. It is a paradox. It's silly, but it's just a fact. It's self-referentially defeating. It's dead, right in the water. There's no need to even talk about it. And by the way, nobody who says that they're a relativist really believes that it's true. An example that's used for that a lot is prescriptions. The relativist goes to the pharmacy and they get a prescription bottle, and the bottle says, hey, take these pills in this order this many times a day. They're going to follow the instructions. They believe that label is making an objective statement, don't they? They don't believe relativism is true when it comes to putting gas in their car, or following the instructions on a prescription bottle, or following traffic laws, or obeying the laws of gravity, or any of those things. They obviously don't believe those things are true.
Or at least they
Okay?
don't want to face the consequences.
Yeah, and so they wouldn't want to face the consequences. But I said, it's true that you can't fly. And I would say, and you said, well, I'm a relativist. And what's true for you may be true for you, but that's not true for me. And you went and walked off into the Grand Canyon,
You're not going to fly.
you would fall and die. Okay? So it is not true that what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. No, and by the way, there is something very appealing in that, and almost Christ-like in this idea of not destroying one another because we disagree with one another. And so that's the appeal. When you say, well, that's so crazy, why does anybody go for that? Because it is the least confrontational belief system in the world. Whatever you believe, you're right. Go have fun. Okay? And the problem is that it just doesn't work with real life. Usually it doesn't manifest itself that way because it's very hostile to Christianity. Because Christianity makes objective truth claims. Christianity makes them very clear, like homosexuality is a sin. The Bible makes it pretty clear there's only two genders, that you were alive in your mother's womb. Yeah, there is an absolute truth, that there's only one way to heaven. And when you start saying things like that, those are objective statements, and that's the most offensive thing in the world to a postmodernist, to a relativist. Now, the other side of that is usually what we deal with in apologetics, which is evidentialism. And evidentialism is really kind of manifests itself in the same way. That's kind of, in a lot of ways, that's kind of a catch-all term that refers to several different ideas. And there's been a lot of attempts at this. A lot of good people, like John Locke, who was a Christian, were evidentialists. And we have a lot of evidentialists around today that are Christians. And they basically believe, in one way or another, that you should have evidence to prove what it is you believe, or you shouldn't believe it. Okay? And that sounds pretty sound, and that's usually what we're doing in apologetics. Let me prove to you that what I believe is true. The problem is that it doesn't really work, and this is why this argument's so good. I'll give you a couple of examples here of evidentialism. One type of evidentialism is called classical foundationalism, okay? And classical foundationalism says that something is true if and only if it is obviously true, or I can prove that it's true with evidence. That sounds like a pretty solid case. There's something bad wrong with it, though. Because classical foundationalism is not obviously true, and you cannot prove that it's true with evidence. So it's got a problem, right? It's self-referentially defeating again. Same way with another type of evidentialism is empiricism. It says that we only beliefs that have meaning are beliefs that can be proven with empirical evidence. You hear that one a lot. Problem with that is that belief cannot be proven with empirical evidence. We got a problem. So when we start dealing with evidentialism, I'm not going to say that there are no kinds of beliefs that we need to prove with evidence, but there are obviously certain kinds of beliefs that can't be proven with evidence. And that's kind of the basis of Plantinga's argument in his book. But Americans tend to take things like relativism and evidentialism for granted, but you'll kind of find out as you talk to people that they really have no idea why they believe that. They don't know where they were taught that. They don't know how to support that. They have no idea what they believe, and they have no idea why it is that they believe it. They just know that they're right. And you kind of have to judge the type of person you're talking to and sort of walk them through with the problem with that thinking. We kind of had that the other day. We had a person say, well, I can only believe something that I can see, touch, smell, and that's why I just really can't believe in God. And I said, I don't really think that's true. He said, well, that's because you have faith. And I said, that's not what faith is. And I kind of had a similar talk like I did this morning in my sermon. Is that that's not what faith is. That's not really fair to use the word faith like that, like it's blind hope. Given the weakness of relativism and evidentialism, we've kind of come up with some new ways to think about the way that we justify our beliefs. And Alvin Plantinga came up with, or he promotes something called externalism, okay? And so there's generally speaking, two types of belief. There's internalism and externalism. Internalism believes that the things that you believe, you don't have to think too hard about this, okay, because it's we're getting kind of off in the philosophical weeds here. Internal means like your beliefs. So if I said, my beliefs are not real, my beliefs are something abstract inside me. They're in here. They're thoughts in my head. And internalists say that the truth and knowledge has more to do with your beliefs in here. And so usually they're evidentialists, and they'll say you have to know all the good reasons why you believe what you believe. Okay? You have to have all the evidence, all the prove what you believe. It has to do with what's in here. An externalist says that that's not true, that the truth and knowledge has to do with what's actually real in the world, what's going on around you, what's going on outside you. And that's what Plantinga believes and promotes. We know, because of the weaknesses of evidentialism and things like that, that there are some kinds of beliefs that are just true, and they're true independent of evidence. Certain kinds of beliefs are beliefs that we just find ourselves with, and we don't have to justify them, we don't have to prove them, they're just true. We don't need evidence, we don't need to justify them. They're true beliefs that we hold without consciously thinking about it. These are either called foundational beliefs, or first beliefs, or properly basic beliefs. An example of a properly basic belief are things like this. The universe did not begin to exist 5 minutes ago. We all agree with that. We don't have to prove that, do we? Now, to be honest, could we prove that? You probably couldn't prove that. As far as you don't know anything outside of this moment is really real. You can't really prove it, can you? But you don't have to. That's ridiculous. I mean, you're perfectly justified in believing that the universe did not begin existing 5 minutes ago, and you shouldn't have to prove that to anybody. You're perfectly rational for believing that. Okay, that is a properly basic belief. These are kinds of beliefs that we don't need to prove. Other examples are you are not stuck in the matrix. You are not in a simulation. You can trust your mind. Other people exist. You're not the only person that exists. Matter exists. Your memories are real. You are yourself and not actually somebody else. Those are all properly basic beliefs. We could talk probably a lot about properly basic beliefs. We could probably go through a long list that you could probably think of that maybe I couldn't think of. Properly basic beliefs are rational beliefs that are justified beliefs. They're not relative. They're not subjective. They don't need to be proven. And sometimes they cannot be proven. We're not saying that all beliefs are this way. There may be certain kinds of beliefs that I should probably prove with evidence, right? I probably shouldn't throw somebody in prison unless I had really good evidence that they were guilty. Not all our beliefs work that way. Matter of fact, Plantinga says that most of your beliefs don't work that way. So for externalists, knowledge has a lot more to do with warrants. This is an important word in epistemology. Question epistemology and the study of knowledge is to identify the difference between knowing something is true and thinking something is true. I can have really good evidence for believing something is true and be wrong. I think most of us here probably believe that O.J. Simpson is wrong, that O.J. Simpson was a murderer, right? Most people in America believe that. Not everybody. You think that you have pretty good evidence, pretty good reasons for believing that? You say, well, yeah, I saw the case, you saw the case, I saw the evidence. It's crazy that happened the way that happened. Okay. Well, what if you got to heaven and you found out that O.J. Simpson did not kill his wife? Would you be surprised? Yeah, but do you think that that's impossible? It's possible that you could go to heaven and find out O.J. Simpson was innocent. That could be the case. You can have really good reasons for believing something and be wrong. And you can have really good evidence and be wrong. You can have perfect scientific support for something and find out that you're wrong. So none of those things count as knowledge, do they? Because I can have really good evidence and still be wrong. So that's not the same thing as knowing something. It's still just my opinion. This is my opinion, and I hold this opinion because of this evidence. So what do I need to say I know that this is true? And for Plantinga, the word, that little magic elusive X factor that we need to make something be knowledge is called warrant. So if you have warrant, now warrant is stronger than justification, okay? If I'm justified in my belief, then that means I have really good reasons for believing it. And you could disagree with me, but you would see where I was coming from. You'd say, I don't think that that's true, but I understand why you might believe that that's true. You're perfectly justified in believing that, but I think you're wrong. Warrant is stronger than that. Warrant is saying, I know. I have knowledge. I know that I'm right. Okay? Properly basic beliefs, by definition of what they are warranted beliefs, not just justified. I have warrant. I know that the universe did not start 5 minutes ago. I do not have to prove that to you. I'm more than just justified in believing this. I have warrant. So why does any of this matter? What's the lesson on epistemology? Well, this is the lesson. Christianity is warranted belief because it is a properly basic belief. And I'm going to explain why. That means that I am perfectly, more than justified, I am warranted in believing Christianity is true, and I don't need evidence to support it. Do I have evidence to support it? Yes. We're going to talk a lot about that. Do I need evidence to support it? No, I don't. And this response works against every single de jure argument against Christianity. Okay? Now, I'm going to quote here. This is Alvin Plantinga talking about the definition of knowledge and warrant. He says, now what is required for knowledge, at least as I said above, is that a belief be produced by cognitive faculties, I'm going to explain this, or processes that are working properly, an appropriate epistemic environment according to a design plan that is aimed at truth and is furthermore successfully aimed at truth. Now, I'm going to break that down. So he says you need to have three things to have warrants, okay? You have to have proper function. Basically, proper function means that you're not inebriated or crazy. It means your cognitive faculties are working the way it's supposed to work. These are really big words for really, really simple ideas. Somebody said one time that philosophy is going into a round room and arguing about where the corner was. This stuff sounds a lot harder than it is. It's not hard. Proper function means that my brain is working the way that my brain is supposed to work. It also has to do with being in a proper environment. That's part of proper function. Like if I grew up in a society that only told lies, that's not a good cognitive environment. So we're assuming that my brain works and it's in a good environment for producing true thoughts. That's the first thing that you need. The second part of having warrant is that those faculties were designed to create true beliefs. And they're not designed to, say, create a coping mechanism. Right? So sometimes if something traumatic happens to us, we have a cognitive faculty that will block out memories. This is a known phenomenon, that something terrible will happen to somebody and they can't remember it. Their brain has blocked it out. That is a cognitive faculty that is not aimed at truth. See what I'm saying? It's aimed at your protection, your mental protection. But we do have cognitive faculties that are aimed at truth, like your memory beliefs, or your sense of taste, or your sense of smell. Your sense of taste is a cognitive faculty that produces true beliefs about the way that things taste. This tastes good, this tastes bad, this tastes sour, this tastes bitter, right? And if it's functioning correctly, you will have true beliefs about the things that you taste. Same way the things that you hear, the things that you smell. Your memory is this way. Memory is probably the best example. When I'm in the right environment and circumstances, my memory will give me true beliefs about the past, and I'm warranted in having those beliefs. Now, if my memory is not functioning correctly, I don't have proper function, and so I don't have warrant anymore. Like somebody who may be losing their mind. Now their cognitive faculties aren't working correct anymore, and they're not bringing them to truth. So to have warrant, I have to have proper function. My brain is working the way it was designed to work. I have to have cognitive faculties that are aimed at truth. And the last part of this is that when these things work correctly, that they normally produce true beliefs. Okay, so those are the three parts of proper function. Okay, you say, okay, well, how does this help me justify my Christianity without evidence? Well, this is where we get to the fun stuff. We got through all the jargon. There's something in theology called the sensus divinitatis, and it means the divine sense. It was created as a term that was invented by John Calvin. But it actually comes from the Bible. It's found in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And you find it in the New Testament in verses like Romans 1:19. You find it in the Old Testament in verses like Psalm 19:1. You can go look those up. But basically, the Bible teaches us that God reveals himself to people. That God wants you to know him. And he has placed things in you to be able to recognize him. That's what this refers to. You have this part of you that God has given you, this spiritual part of you that recognizes God in the world. And that part of you, that's what we call the divine sense. This divine sense is a kind of cognitive faculty. It's a spiritual faculty that you have. And that faculty works by making us aware of God in certain instances. And I think everybody in this room, even if we had some atheists here, would be able to say this, right? You think about maybe whenever you see a sunset, or whenever you look at the stars, or you realize how small you are, or maybe when a baby is born is a big one, right? And you go to the hospital and you hold that little baby in your arms and you go, holy cow, right? This is crazy. And it is this sudden sense of how wonderful, gracious, present, and real God is. And God uses this to reveal himself to us. He's written his fingerprints on the heavens. You look out at the created world around us and we can sense that God is there. Now, this is not an argument from experience. Okay, this is not really making an argument. What I'm not saying is that the birth of a baby proves God exists. It's not what we're saying. We're not saying that a beautiful sunset proves God exists. That's why I know God exists, because I saw a beautiful sunset one time. That's not what divine sense is. It is a cognitive faculty that works in a correct environment. That in certain circumstances, like during a sunset or like during the birth of a child, I become suddenly aware of God's presence. And we have all had moments like this. It is an oh wow moment. Those moments in life that take your breath away and you're suddenly in the presence of God. I've had those in worship services. You ever had one of those experiences in a worship service where it's just like God just knocks your socks off? You know what I mean? Or during a sermon. That was my experience whenever I accepted Christ. That's what drove me down the altar. I can't even remember what Brother John preached on. I just remember God speaking to me, calling out to me, and I knew that I needed to call on Jesus. That is the divine sense. God has revealed himself to us. This is what's really cool about this. If the divine sense is real, like we're saying it is, in Christian belief it is real, okay? And by the way, we say, yeah, but atheists, they don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in divine sense. It doesn't matter, because you're not trying to prove to the atheist that God exists. You're trying to defend what you believe. And if he's going to attack your belief, he's going to have to grant you some things, okay? And so on Christian belief, I believe that God has revealed himself to me, and that I have a cognitive faculty that I'm calling the divine sense. And that cognitive faculty is properly basic. It is a properly basic belief, just like my memory beliefs, just like my sense of taste and smell. It is something that my body has, and it's not a coping mechanism. It is something aimed at truth. That God has given me a cognitive faculty that is designed to produce true beliefs in me when it works correctly about God. Now, sometimes it doesn't work correctly because of sin and things like that. But whenever it works correctly, it produces, in the right environment, true beliefs about God. This is not me saying, oh, I saw a sunset, now I believe God exists. This is a belief that arises in me. And by every definition of a properly basic belief, this is properly basic belief, okay? And it means that it is warranted belief. You can know that it's true, just like you know that your memory beliefs are true, and you don't have to defend it with evidence. And you say, well, that's a lot of information that's really abstract. So I have a long excerpt here that's taken from Alvin Plantinga's book where he breaks this down in a really practical way. I started to break it down myself, but I cannot say it better than Alvin Plantinga did. And so I thought we'd read it together. It's right here in our handout. Where he breaks down how warranted Christian belief works practically and why I don't need evidence to protect my Christianity. Okay? Listen to what he says. He says, it isn't at all difficult for a Christian, even a sophisticated and knowledgeable contemporary believer, aware of all of the criticisms and contrary currents of opinion, to be justified in this sense in her belief. And this, whether or not she believes in God or in more specific Christian doctrines on the basis of propositional evidence. For consider such a believer. She is aware of the objections people have made to Christian belief. She has read and reflected on Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, not to mention Flude, Mackey, and Nielsen. Those are all famous atheists. And the other critics of Christian or theistic belief. She knows that the world contains many who do not believe as she does. She doesn't believe on the basis of propositional evidence. She therefore believes in a basic way, the way we've been talking about. Can she be justified in believing in God this way? The answer seems pretty easy. She reads Nietzsche, but remains unmoved by his complaint that Christianity fosters a weak, whining, whimpering, say that word. It means cowardly. Say it, Miss Laura. Pusillanimous. Pusillanimous. There we go. Duplicitous and generally disgusting kind of person. Most of the Christians she knows of, Mother Teresa, for example, don't fit that mold. She finds Freud's contemptuous attitude toward Christianity and theistic belief backed by little more than implausible fantasies about the origin of belief in God. Patricide and the primal horde. Can he be serious? And she finds little more substance in Marx. She thinks as carefully as she can about these objections and others, but finds them wholly uncompelling. On the other side, although she is aware of theistic arguments and thinks some of them not without value, she doesn't believe on the basis of them. I'm going to stop right there. That is really important. How many of you were aware of the cosmological argument when you became a Christian? How many of you were aware of the minimal facts argument when you became a Christian? We have really good evidence for believing Christianity is true, but the reality is, for 95% of us, it had nothing to do with the reason we became Christians. Because we become Christians because of this divine sense. As God revealed himself to us, that's why we became Christians. And so it's cool that there's really good evidence, and it's really exciting to talk about, but that's not why we're Christians. We're Christians because it's properly basic belief, okay? She doesn't believe on the basis of them. Rather, I love this, she has a rich inner spiritual life, the sort described in the early pages of Jonathan Edwards' Religious Affections. It seems to her that she is sometimes made aware, catches a glimpse of something of the overwhelming beauty and loveliness of the Lord. She is often aware, as it strongly seems to her, of the work of the Holy Spirit in her heart, comforting, encouraging, teaching, leading her to accept the great things of the gospel, as Edwards calls them, helping her see that the magnificent scheme of salvation devised by the Lord himself is not only for others, but for her as well. After long, hard, conscientious reflection, this all seems to her enormously more convincing than the complaints of the critics. Is she then going contrary to duty and believing as she does? Is she being irresponsible? Certainly not. There could be something defective about her, some malfunction not apparent on the surface. She could be mistaken, a victim of illusion or wishful thinking despite her best efforts. She could be wrong, desperately wrong, pitiably wrong in thinking these things. Nevertheless, she isn't flouting any discernible duty. She is fulfilling her epistemic responsibility. She is doing her level best. She is justified. And this is not only true, but obviously true. What a wonderful breakdown the way this works. I told you it's a really complicated idea, but it's actually a really simple idea. That the reason we believe in God is because God has revealed himself to us. And that makes us justified and rational in believing that it's real without evidence. Okay? Jure Objections, and this is the point of this whole thing, and I'm done. The Jure Objections are arguing that there is something wrong with you for thinking that Christianity is true. That you're either stupid or crazy or superstitious or immoral, some kind of evil bigot, or some kind of combination of those things. And Plantinga's model, which by the way, it's known as the AC model, the Aquinas-Calvin model, because it kind of draws from those two guys, Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. And it shows us that this kind of accusation is totally absurd. There is outstanding evidence to support Christian belief, but that is not the reason that most of us are Christians. Most of us are Christians because we believe in one way or another that God has revealed himself to us. This is not an argument from religious experience. Most of us believe in God because we have this divine sense in us that God has used to reveal himself to us. And believing that way is properly basic. The same way my memories are properly basic, the same way that my sense of taste is properly basic. It is perfectly rational. It does not need to be supported by evidence, even though it could be. Now, this does not prove that God exists. But we're not trying to prove that God exists. What we're trying to prove is that I am a rational person for believing Christianity is true. And that's different. See what I'm saying? If this was me trying to convince you to become a Christian, then I would need to have some evidence probably, right? I would need to be able to convince you. But if you're attacking me, like many of these arguments are, and you're saying I'm stupid, I'm crazy, I don't have enough evidence, well, I don't have to convince you to be a Christian. I have to defend myself. Say, no, I'm not crazy. And the way he does this is by making this argument about properly basic belief. I believe in God in the same way that I believe my wife exists. I don't have to prove it. I have a relationship with my God. I speak to my God every day, and he speaks to me. He works in my heart and reveals himself to me. And I can't prove this to you. How am I supposed to prove to you that God speaks to me when I pray? How am I supposed to prove to you that I felt the Holy Spirit screaming at me to walk down the aisle and accept Christ? I can't prove that to you. And so some type of argument from experience would be very weak, but all I can tell you is God's revealed himself to me. And I can't prove this to you, but guess what? I don't have to prove this to you. And I'm perfectly rational for believing it. There's nothing unjustified about me believing that God speaks to me. I believe in God, and I believe that God gave me a sense gave me the ability to sense him when he reveals himself, and I believe he has revealed himself. And I believe this in spite of atheism's best criticism. And just as Alvin Plantinga broke down there, I love that quote, that I am justified. And this is not only true, this is obviously true. There you go.